Wills are a fantastic source, often rich in the kind of information about people's lives that you just don't get anywhere else. As we go back in time, they're often some of the only sources left to us by the middling and lower sorts. Historians of all types use wills, from the genealogist who uses them for reconstructing a family tree, to the historian of religion who uses them to measure the impact of religious change over time. Wills take to local history like ducks to water. They can be used on a large scale to reconstruct communities and family ties, but also to think about belief, trade, material culture, and much more besides. A will is rooted in its society, and we can really use it to place a person. A testator claims at the very beginning where they belong to, often where they want to be buried, and other places associated with them during their life, such as where they came from, where their friends and family lived, perhaps even where they did trade, and other places they might have owned property. They're also useful for finding out about the lives of people mentioned within a will. We can often see the very lowest kinds of people, water bearers, servants, maids, agricultural labourers, the kind of people who maybe don't appear in everyday records in their own right, but are mentioned from a small bequest or even as a witness to a will. So these can all be very useful ways of finding out about a local area. I'm going to introduce you to using wills for local history. And we'll set out just what wills are, see where you can find them, and how you understand them. Lastly, I'll go through some uses of wills, hopefully giving you some inspiration of how to use them yourself. A will, or last will and testament, originally dealt with immovable property, such as land and houses, and personal items, such as clothes or money. A will was the immovable property, and a testament the personal items. In England from the early modern period onwards, the last will and testament was in practice one and the same document, and this is usually referred to as a will. Different types of custom influenced the making of a will, and it's useful to find out what these were in your place. For example, in most of England, inheritance of property was traditionally to the eldest son, but in Kent, the custom of gavelkind was followed, where property was bequeathed equally between sons. Wills come with health warnings, so take your time to get used to them and learn what to watch out for. Some key issues are, first, that they don't give a complete picture. They only show part of a person's life, and this is at the time of their death, let alone in previous years. 2. Wills are very formulaic, and it can be difficult to work through the often dense legal language. 3. They are usually written in a hand that takes practice to get used to, especially in the early modern when they are written usually in secretary hand. There's some resources at the end of this talk to help you. 4. Finding the right wills for your place can be tricky. For local historians in particular, we need to be aware of where we find the wills for our place. And we'll cover this in a separate slide. Very importantly, wills don't represent the whole of society. They were most often approved by wealthier men. Women in particular are very underrepresented, as until the 19th century, married women couldn't write a will without their husband's consent. This doesn't mean that there aren't wills of the poorer sorts and of women, but the majority of wills were written by men of the middling and upper sorts. And lastly, like any historical documents, wills aren't necessarily accurate. They were written from a particular perspective, and we must bear in mind that they were also subject to tampering and human error. A will was made by the testator, usually in an act which was witnessed by 2 or 3 named persons, known as witnesses. A testator would appoint an executor or 2 to apply to the court to prove the will. This meant that the court granted probate, which enabled the conditions of the will to be carried out by law. Sometimes overseers were appointed by the testator to assist executors in carrying out the conditions of the will. Although only a minority of people made wills, a surprising amount of people across society did, so it's always worth having a look. Valid wills could not be made by lunatics, prisoners, traitors or heretics. And on an unrelated note, there aren't many wills in my family tree. Okay, so this is the big question for local historians. In what court were wills from your place proved, and therefore, where are they recorded for you to find them today? What I'm about to say next only applies to England. In Scotland, wills are available before 1925 with the website Scotland's People, and after then with the National Registers of Scotland. In Wales, wills before 1858 are held by the National Library of Wales. In England and Wales, wills were proved in different courts through the church system before this process was centralised with the National Probate Act in 1858. From here you can trace things pretty easily. Before this we had a tiered system, and so wills today are held in different places depending on this. This can be the local record office or another place. It was normal for a will before 1858 to be proved in an archdeaconry, if all your property was within that archdeaconry area. If your property lay within two archdeaconries, but within the same diocese, this went to the judgment of the bishop at his consistory court. If you were pretty rich, however, and had property over more than one diocese, then your will went to the archbishop, to the prerogative court at York for the northern province, or the prerogative court of Canterbury for the southern province. These top courts also had status, were known for security, efficiency and discretion, and so people went there if they had a lot of money and status. This was increasingly the case during the early modern period, where many more gentry, middling sorts, merchants, people that had done quite well through trade, began to have their wills proved at the prerogative courts. The records of wills from the prerogative court at York are held in the Borthwick in York, and for Canterbury they're held by the National Archives, and these are available online. In cases of dispute between the two courts, Canterbury had precedence, as well as holding wills of people whose property was abroad, or if you died abroad, such as seamen. There were, however, exceptions to this. Very occasionally wills were proved in commissary courts when a bishop went on his visitation every few years. These are usually held in a separate bundle of wills. During the Commonwealth period in the 1650s, all wills were proved in the PCC, the Prerogative Court of Canterbury in London. Most importantly of all were peculiars, areas which fell under separate jurisdictions, such as the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, manors, certain cathedrals, towns, and areas under royal prerogative, such as Windsor. Of course, the most famous peculiar is Masham in Yorkshire, which we all know for the beer. The best source for finding out where wills in your area are held is the Phillimore Atlas, which is available to buy as a book and which has been digitised through Ancestry. Most wills from the 16th century onwards were in English, and very few were in Latin after then. Sometimes wills in Scotland could be in Old Scots. Wills were often written around a structure, and the scribe, who was a literate local person, often a parish priest or clerk, would use a similar format for all the wills they wrote. And from the 16th century onwards, printed manuals were available for scribes to use. It's important to remember that some wills are bigger than others. They vary in size from a few lines to several pages. Often much of this was legalistic language, and depending on the type of will and the conditions under which it was written, this can vary quite a lot. Wills start with a basic preamble dealing with the bequest of the soul, often noting the place of burial, place of residence. They then move on to the bequests, usually beginning with item, and they also name executors and overseers. At the end of the will, the testator signs off, often declaring all previous wills null and void, and names witnesses who, if you have the original will have signed or left their mark at the end. Sometimes amendments were made to a will through a codicil, which was signed and dated with separate witnesses, sometimes days, weeks, months, or even years after the original will was proved. Wills can be used in so many ways. They tell us a great deal about the people who lived in a place, from what they owned to who their friends and family were, and sometimes even what they thought. They usually have a lot to say about wealthier people in a community, but can tell us about all kinds of people, sometimes because they prove wills of their own, and often because they were mentioned in the wills of wealthier people. We can use them across a community, thinking about religion, literacy, charity, trade, but also about familial ties, and on a more specified basis. I've found in wills lists of possessions, records of debts, gifts to all manner of friends, as well as hard-nosed comments about wayward sons and grasping business partners. They can illuminate parts of your local history study or become a key part of it. Because they're such an important source for all kinds of historian, there's lots of resources available on wills, from books to online help with paleography to courses that are run that can help you really get to grips with them. And I've listed a few of my favourites below. Wills can take some time to understand, but if you do take that time and the effort to learn, they can become an invaluable resource for your local history study. My advice is the best thing to do is to dive in. Practice makes perfect.